As we approach the American Revolution, it's important to figure out just who these American colonists were. One thing is for certain: they were migrants. Originally, migrants from Europe found their way to the New World and landed on the coasts. After conflict with the Native Americans migrated further west towards Appalachia. Thus, just as the Europeans migrated, so too did the Native Americans migrate. Now, migration across the Atlantic was a dangerous prospect. There was always fear of shipwreck and storms, seasickness, dysentery, scurvy. The meat was old and oversalted. Lice was rampant. Foul water made people sick, and smallpox was a threat. In fact, it was a very dangerous proposition indeed. And then once you arrived, you were only permitted to leave the disease-infested ship once you were able to pay for your passage. Colonists also moved from colony to colony based on land availability, trade with Native Americans or trouble with Native Americans, and also religious persecution. The pattern was continually westwards towards unclaimed frontier land. Many migrations were also of large family groups, particularly among the German migrants. And the locals were often distrustful of any new migrants. So if a new person came into a town, they might be distrusted and they would be pushed further west towards the frontier. British migration occurred for several different reasons. Religious freedom was a common one, also economic opportunity and land. Most people arrived as indentured servants, meaning that they had to work for the passage of their ship. The work might last 4 to 7 years. But also about 9% of the people who arrived were criminals. There were certain waves of British migration. In the 1620s and 1640s, Massachusetts had migrants that left because of religious reasons. These were English separatists and Puritans. Virginia in the 1640s and 1670s had a lot of aristocratic sons and indentured servants come to claim its land. Maryland in the 1660s saw a lot of Catholic migrants. Pennsylvania saw Quakers in the 1670s through the 1720s. And Irish and Scotch-Irish lived in the frontiers after they arrived throughout much of the 18th century. There were also other European migration patterns as well. In the 17th century, the Dutch and the Belgians went to an area called New Amsterdam, which would later be renamed New York City. And the Swedes and the Finns came along the Delaware. Germans went to Pennsylvania and New York in the 18th century, and of course there were many French and Spanish people as well. Now, African migration was of a particular type. It was involuntary migration due to the slave trade. The slave trade was particular in that it was called the triangle trade. Now, a triangle, as you know, has 3 sides, and the triangle trade had 3 sides as well. You'll recall that I mentioned a couple lessons ago about how the Atlantic Ocean had a certain current that would allow ships to just follow the current, first from Europe down to Africa, then across the Atlantic to South America, then up to North America, and then back around. And this became the passage of the triangle trade. Ships would leave Britain, for example, bound with certain goods that African chiefs and leaders would find valuable, often guns. They would follow the current south into Africa, unload their hold, sell all the guns, and then buy a bunch of slaves. From Africa, they would go across the Atlantic to South America and unload the slaves and get a bunch of raw materials. If they didn't stop in South America, they might also go up to North America. And so in this pattern, those were the parts of the triangle trade: Europe, Africa, and then the New World. And over, this pattern would happen. Each time the ship's hold was full of goods, sometimes finished goods, sometimes slaves, human goods, or sometimes raw materials. The triangle trade was extremely profitable. Now, it's estimated by about 1776, the population of slave migrants in the United States is about 275,000, most of them from West Africa. An additional 200,000 slaves had been born here of other slaves, such that by the American Revolution there are almost 500,000 enslaved people. By far, most of the migrants in the New World were African at this point. Some Africans were able to buy, earn, or otherwise acquire their freedom in the 17th century, but by the American Revolution, this was extremely uncommon. Black slaves were seen as superior to the Native American slaves because their skin clearly marked them as separate and other. They could be identified easily, and their land, language, and cultural knowledge was weaker, and therefore they were more foreign, and it was harder for them to hide. Also, Africans were less susceptible to malaria than Native Americans. But that doesn't mean that Native Americans were not enslaved. They, in fact, were enslaved quite a bit, especially in the 16th and 17th century. They were wiped out, large quantities of population removed by smallpox in the 16th century, but even as their populations were starting to rebound, Europeans began to enslave them. In general, Native Americans were pushed west as Europeans came west. If they couldn't be relocated or killed, they were often enslaved. But enslaved Native Americans were dangerous because they knew the land, and they also were able to hide among the people easier. So oftentimes, Native Americans who were enslaved were sold to the Caribbean, plantations on the different Caribbean islands. And in this way, the Native Americans were uprooted and forcibly migrated as well. So our main point for today's lesson has been this. The United States was always a nation of migrants from all kinds of peoples, Europeans, Africans, and also First Nation people. In all these ways, we're all migrants.